So welcome everybody to this event in the University of Birmingham Festival. This is an event called Research That Matters. Universities only do two things. We find things out and we tell people about them. And in this event, we're going to do both of those. I'm Professor Jeremy Pritchard. I'm the Director of Education for Life and Environmental Sciences. I'm actually a plant scientist, and you may or may not be pleased to know that you won't be hearing anything about plant sciences today. You'll be hearing a lot of different things, but not plant sciences. Here's our panel of researchers from across the university covering many aspects of our research and education. Really pleased that they've taken the time to come here today and talk to us. What they're going to do, they're going to talk for 5 to 7 minutes each, and that isn't very long to get across the huge quality and impact of their research. So what we're going to do through this is you're going to be able to interact via Slido and ask questions online. And at the end, not after each presentation, but at the end of this section, we'll ask the questions of the audience based on what you've put onto Slido. Remember, we have students and other people in the audience here in the beautiful exchange in the centre of Birmingham today. We have people watching on YouTube and also via Weibo. And all three audiences will be able to put in questions via Slido. And hopefully at the end, whatever questions you want to ask, whatever you're interested in, remember there's no such thing as a trivial question, will stimulate discussion about the rich vein of research that you're going to hear about in the next hour or so. So make a note of that Slido link and put in the number, as it says there, 922405, and you'll be able to post a question. You'll be able to like other people's questions. So if somebody's put a question in that you were going to ask, like that, and then it will come to the top of the list, and we'll then pitch those questions to the researchers at the end of the session. Really exciting time, really great to see so many people in the audience and watching remotely as well. You will be able to follow this on catch-up as well. So without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Merton to come and give his talk on global ethics.
Hello everyone, my name is Merton. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy in the College of Arts and Law. And today I'm here because I would like to talk to you about my research on the topic of a human right to free internet access. So as a philosopher who works on moral theory, I mostly ask questions about how things should be. How things are is very important as well to colleagues of mine and to me who work on normative topics. But normative ethics is very much asking about how things should be and why. So a couple of years ago, I became quite interested in the internet, a technology that has changed all of our lives and that we can hardly think that we could do without in many respects. Sure, the pandemic has brought to the fore the importance of the internet, as we all have been relying on doing things online when we couldn't do things in person. But even before the pandemic, and also after the pandemic, again, we will rely on the internet a great deal. So I became quite interested in trying to think about the ethical importance of the internet. Why is the internet not just a thing that is nice to have, but why is the internet also important? Why is it important enough that we should think about not only how things develop on their own, but maybe how we should shape this medium? Why it's important enough, for instance, for us as democracies and as political communities to think about how we want our internet to be. Again, the question is not so much about just finding out how the internet is, but how it should be. And in particular, I became quite interested in the topic of internet access. Now, there isn't something like a human right to internet access. There are recommendations by the UN, by other bodies, that we should ensure that people have internet access, but they don't really guarantee that people should have access to the internet. I'm trying to establish a different claim here, a different argument. I want to say we should think about the internet in a different way. It's really that important that we have to guarantee that everybody around the world has free access to it. What do I mean by free? So I just want to try to clarify here briefly what that entails. The internet, I think, internet access to should be free globally. That's why it should be a human right. Not only in the sense of having some access to it, but it should be guaranteed. There should be a universal guarantee for access, some form of access to everyone around the world. That means that those who cannot afford it should have it publicly funded for them, some sort of access in some way. This is free in the first sense. There's free in the second sense, I think, that internet access shouldn't be arbitrarily interfered with. It shouldn't be shut down for no good reason. It shouldn't be surveilled. It shouldn't be censored. When we are online, we shouldn't arbitrarily be monitored. We shouldn't be misinformed. So I think public authorities also have duties not just to provide internet access, but they also have duties to do more, to protect a certain quality of access. And also, by the way, to make sure that people have the digital skills that are required to actually make use of internet access. Why is this important? Well, it's important because globally 51% of humanity have internet access, which means that 49 do not. We take it for granted that we have access to the internet, that we can use it any time, but very, very many people in the world, a significant part of humanity, doesn't have that luxury. The second reason why this right is important, why the argument for this right is important, why it matters, why it would matter a great deal if we could establish a human right to internet access so that public authorities accept it as a novel right and basically institute this right, is that there are, of course, many ways how internet access is arbitrarily restricted these days. It is controlled, it is censored, it is monitored, and it is shut down without good reason in many places around the world. So this right would give us an argument, would give us a tool, an argumentative tool for saying that this is wrong and also explain why this is wrong. Now, briefly, let me say something about why I think I want to argue for something so strong as a human right to internet access. So I would argue that internet access is an essential part of, today, minimally decent lives, leading minimally decent lives in digitalized societies. And as such, it's an entitlement. It's become a basic utility, just like water and power and other things that are very basic to us. And in that sense, and because of that, it requires public protection and provision in some cases. So my research really here, to wrap up, is about explaining the moral value and ethical importance, or the practical importance, of internet access for having the opportunities to actually enjoy decent lives in digitalized societies. And in particular, and this is what the argument is based on, why the internet is so important ultimately, we need it today to make use, to have adequate opportunities of all the other rights that we have. You have a right to free speech, to free assembly, to all of that. And I think today, if we want to have adequate opportunities to realize those rights, to make use of our rights, we need the internet access. That's the argument, that's my work, and I hope to provide an argument that will convince people and that we can make sure in the future that people have adequate access, free access to the internet. Thank you. Next, let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Richard Mokes, a lecturer in healthcare technologies, who's going to take over now. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everybody, and I'm really delighted to be able to stand here and actually talk to you about some of the work that we do in chemical engineering. So I think one of the first things I wanted to say is that when most people think about chemical engineering, they often think about drilling, petrochemical, or big plants, big chimneys, factories, and things like that, which, in my opinion, is a little bit boring. I'm a little bit biased because of the work I do, but actually, chemical engineering is a much broader area than that, and it actually spans into things like foods, healthcare, paints, and actually, if you think about your daily routine and since you got up this morning and what you did, you realise that actually chemical engineers have engineered everything in your lifestyle for you. So you will have got up, you will have had a shower, you would have used shower gel or soap. That's engineered. You go down, you have breakfast. Even the milk that you pour on your cereals is actually engineered for you to like it. And then some people might be using biros, phones and things like that, and everything like that, again, is all engineered for you. So actually, we're a much bigger scope than what most people think. But my particular research is in translational medicine, and again, it sounds more like this is medicine than engineering, but actually it's not. It's looking at that pathway from going from basic research all the way through to getting it to the patient. And actually chemical engineering comes in multiple times in this field, because we have to look at how we can engineer the materials and the things that we want. We then have to look at how we can scale these up so that we can actually make them for the patient, and then take it to the patient, so logistics and things around that. So actually what I'm going to be talking to you today about, hopefully, without that spoiler alert there, is about scarring. And what I'm focused and what we've been focused on lately is looking at preventing scarring from happening, but actually on the cornea. So what happens if you get an infection or some type of trauma to the front of the eye is the body wants to heal it. It wants to heal it as quick as it can. And in doing so, it gets very confused and ends up making new tissue for the front of the eye, but it's not how it's supposed to be. And this causes a cloudiness or haze to actually form across the front of your eye, and it renders you blind. So it's a bit like what I'm trying to show on the projector here, is you're able to see bits, but actually it becomes cloudy and hazy, and in the densest part of the scar, you just won't be able to see through it. And actually, once you get to this type of point within the scarring, you have very limited options to get your sight back. You would have to go in for a surgical intervention where they would actually take the front of the eye away and replace it with donor tissue, which isn't optimal. So what we've been looking at doing is coming up with new eye drops that you can actually just drop onto the eye post-trauma, and then that will allow it to heal in a much more controlled and sensible way, so that you actually don't get this hazing from occurring. And we do this by taking our spanners and hammers down to a molecular level, and we actually look at trying to structure the materials in such a way, engineer the materials in such a way that what we can do is we can get it to sit on the eye, stay on the eye, and actually provide a therapy for long enough to actually allow the healing process to take place. Going forward. So how do we do this? As I've said previously, we branch across a lot of areas, and actually we branch across quite a lot of disciplines. So to be able to do this, we need to be able to interact with fundamental biologists, physicists, chemists. Also, we need to be able to talk to engineers. We need them to be able to make the plants, to be able to scale it. We need to be able to make the processes in which we can change our chemicals into these things. And we bring those together along with actually people like patients and clinicians. So it's not only good enough that we can come up with something, we need to come up with something that a patient will use. So for instance, if you suggest that you want to deliver this drug by an injection to the eye, it makes most people wince without the disease, but actually if you've got a diseased eye as well, you really don't want an injection. So we have to come up with ways to get around that, so things like eye drops work there. And obviously the clinicians are key. We need to be able to talk to people that know how the diseases work, what we need to do, and can give us information. So it encompasses a lot of people, and in doing it in this way, by talking to people and using experts in all different fields, we can become very dynamic. So we can actually pivot the research that we're doing. So an example of this is that we were starting with ocular scarring. We went into a pandemic, and we sat there and we thought, what can we try and do to help with this pandemic? And what we did is we talked to the people that mattered, what they want, what they thought would be helpful. And what we ended up doing was restructuring some of the materials, some of the products that we've already worked with previously in order to make a nasal spray. So this is something that we did during the COVID pandemic, create a nasal spray, coats the nose and stops you from being able to uptake a virus in a very physical way, as opposed to looking at the medicine and trying to change it that way. So I think in general, what I'm trying to say here is we're in chemical engineering. We're much bigger than what most people think about chemical engineering. And actually what we're trying to do is engineer solutions that can help people with their everyday lives. And the work, obviously, that I'm doing is trying to help them have better healthcare, basically. So on that note, I will pass over to the next speaker, who I just skipped into the slides. I apologise. But the next speaker is Ian.
Can I just say, make sure that you put your questions in and also like the questions. If somebody's put a question in, you can like it and it comes to the top of the list.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and yeah, good afternoon to everyone. It's great to see everyone here, and also to our online audience. So yeah, I'm Dr. Ian Bodley. I'm in the School of Sport, Exercise and Rehabilitation Sciences in the College of Life and Environmental Sciences, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about my research looking at doping in sport and exercise. And you know, often when people think about, or when you talk to people about doping in sport, or doping or use of image and performance-enhancing drugs, and you talk about sport and exercise, people think about some of the more famous cases, such as Lance Armstrong, who we see here, who, as many of us will know, lost his 7 Tour de France titles when he was found out to have used prohibited substances and methods. And then went on the Oprah Winfrey Show quite famously and admitted to that. And obviously the implications for him as an athlete made this a really big news story. But it's important to recognise that this is an issue not just in sport and also in exercise as well. So some research that I was involved with, led by Professor Vivian Hope at Liverpool John Moores University last year, we estimated that we think there's in the region of about 450,000 men who use anabolic steroids in the UK or have done recently, and around about 45,000 women was our estimate for the females. So obviously there's a male bias there, but in the region of around 500,000 people using anabolic steroids. So this is a significant issue in exercise as well. So in my research, I'm quite interested in looking at both of these contexts. And when you look at them, what you find is that they converge in several ways, but they also diverge in different ways. So in terms of, one of the ways that they converge is in the drugs that are used. So from one athlete to the next, in either a sport or an exercise context, we might see differences in the actual patterns of use across those athletes. But by and large, on the whole, when we look across the two contexts, it's the same number, the same types of drugs that are being used across athletes. So there is some overlap and convergence there. But one area that they do diverge is generally in the primary motivations for use of these drugs and methods. So in sport, one of the primary motivations, as you might imagine, is about performance enhancement, especially in elite sport, where we're looking at that sort of top one, trying to gain that 1-2% that might make the difference between a 4th place and a gold medal at the Olympics. Whereas in exercise, by and large, or for the majority of the people that are using these substances, it's more of an aesthetic driver in terms of their appearance and how the drugs can influence or help their training to improve their appearance. So we definitely, there is some overlap across the two contexts there, but we definitely see primary motives being different. Another area that they diverge is in why these are important issues and why research in this area matters. So if we think about sport, it's primarily about sort of the ethics of sport and fair play, and making sure that we have as much as possible a level playing field across athletes, so people aren't having the opportunity to get an unfair advantage. And that's why we have this anti-doping system to try to minimise the impacts and the use of these drugs. Whereas in the exercise context, it's much more about the harm that's being done. Because it's an unregulated context in terms of the use in the exercise context, we see much higher levels of use of the drug. So supraphysiological levels of anabolic steroid use, for example, have been linked with several harmful outcomes for people in terms of some of the physical harms, in terms of effects on the cardiac tissue, damage and early aging of the brain. But we also see effects on mood state and anxiety, and also interpersonal functioning. So there are many harms that are associated with anabolic steroid use in the exercise context. So there's definitely some differences there. But where we do see again some convergence is around some of the psychological factors that are linked to and thought to facilitate the use of these drugs and methods. And that's where over the last 10 years a lot of my research has been focused on trying to identify what some of these psychological factors and processes are that lead people to using prohibited methods and harmful substances. And one of the things that we found, one of the more consistent findings, is to look at the guilt that people experience, or how people anticipate feeling guilt when they use these substances. And what we tend to find, or what is a consistent finding, is that we see much lower levels of anticipated guilt in people who use the substances, compared to if you ask someone who doesn't use them how much they would anticipate feeling guilty as a result. And one of the psychological factors or processes that we've identified that is linked with these lower levels of anticipated guilt is something that's collectively known as moral disengagement, and that's a series of 6 different psychosocial mechanisms. So these processes that people can use that involves psychological processes, but also their interaction with the environment, that allow them to justify and rationalize using these substances. And because of this environmental influence here, these mechanisms are often socially influenced. So people can pick up and learn how they can justify and rationalise using them from the people that they interact with. So what we've also identified is that the environment that people train in and the people that they compete with is very influential in terms of their likelihood of gravitating towards using these substances. So in terms of intervention, and that's much more where our research is moving now, is trying to identify what some of the primary intervention points, the best places to interact with athletes, to try to educate and change people's behaviours to make it less harmful or less likely that people use these substances. And again, this is where we see some differences. So in terms of sport, the primary intervention point is really through the education that elite athletes receive from anti-doping organisations, national anti-doping organisations. So we've been doing work with national anti-doping organisations across Europe, including UK anti-doping here in the UK, to try to understand what some of the best methods of education are, but also to influence the education programmes that they have, and helping them to monitor and evaluate those systems so they can develop their education to be most effective. We've also worked with the World Anti-Doping Agency, who govern all of those national anti-doping organisations across the globe, to identify what some of the most important areas of research are needed to sort of take our understanding forward. And then that's now influencing their policy at a global level. Whereas in the exercise context, it's quite a different intervention point. So the primary intervention point for harm reduction work with people who use anabolic steroids and associated drugs are the needle exchange clinics, where these athletes will attend to try and, or not to try to, but actually to get clean and injecting equipment. But what also happens in these clinics is quite a lot of the clinics have harm reduction clinics that athletes can attend, and it's an opportunity for education and trying to give harm reduction advice. So we're working with many of those, some of the better examples of those clinics nationally, to identify what the best examples of practice are, but also to evaluate their practice, to try to improve again and to reduce the amount of harmful use of anabolic steroids. So that's just a few examples of some of the research we've done, and hopefully that's communicated to you some of the why I think this is research that matters and important. So I'll look forward to answering some of your questions and hopefully talking about some of those issues a little bit more. Thank you. Okay, so I'll pass on to my colleague, Isolda Romero. I'll let you come through then.
Thank you very much. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Isolda. I'm from the School of Pharmacy at the College of Medical Sciences. And I am here to talk to you today about why I'm passionate about the periodic table and why my research is trying to exploit at maximum that periodic table. So we are going to talk about cancer drug discovery. Cancer is something that touches everybody, but with a twist. And the twist is the world of possibilities that the periodic table allows us to look for. So don't feel scared, don't go back to A-levels and traumas with chemistry, but yes, this is a periodic table. And what I want to tell you is that in life in general, yes, we are carbon-based. And yes, it's true, we use very, very, very few elements to be alive, okay? And most of the things that we have to do in life in general are based in the little light blue section of the periodic table, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. But we cannot forget that nature actually uses metals for very, very important processes in life. So every time that you breathe, is iron who takes a molecule of oxygen from one place to another. Every time that you flex a muscle, it happens to be calcium and potassium changing sides from a membrane. And there are more and more examples of metals being useful. There is cobalt in the breakfast cereal that you had this morning, and that is a vitamin that we all need to survive. So the question is here, if nature has evolved to use metals in very smart ways, why can't we use and why can't we exploit that into drug discovery? Carbon, if you look at it at the top, has only 4 anchoring points. And with 4 anchoring points, there is a limited number of shapes that I can generate when I bind it to other atoms. But if I choose a metal, and we have the pretty pictures at the bottom, then I have a wide range of shapes, a wide range of numbers of anchoring points, and that gives me way more flexibility for what I can do in the terms of chemistry. So what I am passionate about is at exploiting this for cancer drug discovery. Right now, if you look at CR UK, our biggest cancer charity in the country, there are 3 options for treatment of cancer. One is surgically removing it, another one is radiotherapy, and the third one is chemotherapy. And if you look at the molecule at the top left, it is a completely organic molecule. And by organic, I mean it's full of carbon, hydrogens, and nitrogens, oxygens, but that is about it. And we all know that with the statistics that we have nowadays, that 1 in 2 people will develop cancer in their lifetimes, we need more drugs, we need better drugs, and we need drugs that would allow us, yes, to get the cancer, but also to increase the level of people that actually survive the cancer. If we look at what is happening in the cancer treatment arena in the world, and especially in the UK, the little molecule that you see there in yellow is used in 50% of all chemotherapeutic regimes, and that is a lot of people receiving that drug. And if you look closely, there is a platinum in the center, and that is a metal. This drug was found by absolute chance, and we can talk about that later, but it is there and we use it, but it's not the best drug. And it's not the best drug because it acts by binding or attacking DNA. And I cannot differentiate the DNA of a cancer molecule from the DNA of a healthy cell. And because I cannot differentiate the hats in the DNA, this drug goes and damages healthy cells and cancer cells the same. So in my research, what I am trying to do with my group is finding something that is different between cancer cells and normal cells and exploit that as a target for my metal drugs to act and exploit weaknesses that are originally there in the cancer cells already that I can maximize and help kill cancer cells. What I have found that is very useful is that mitochondria, which are these little ovals, are very different and they behave very differently in cancer cells and in normal cells. And by having that difference, my drugs allow a selectivity between what happens to a normal cell that is exposed to my metal drugs and to a cancer cell. Like that, hopefully, we will have a drug that cures the cancer without killing the patient in between. So metals like platinum, you can find them in fancy wedding rings, for example, and I work with fancy metals like ruthenium, iridium, and osmium that maybe are names that are a little bit more complicated than just carbon, but they have a fantastic chemistry, and that is what I am passionate about, and that is what I am happy to chat even more with you after in the round of questions. So, if I may continue, I will introduce the next speaker, Professor Christopher Pierroni.
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm Professor Christopher Pierroni. I'm director of the Birmingham Leadership Institute. The Birmingham Leadership Institute, we exist to understand more about the nature of the leadership required to make progress on the most complex and pressing contemporary challenges, and then to try and help develop more of that kind of leadership. So we have both a research and a practice focus, and our work is very much at the intersection of the two, understanding more and figuring out how to get more of it. We're actually based here in the Exchange, so it's very nice to be able to welcome those of you who are here to our home. We're really lucky that this is our base, and we work very deliberately within Birmingham and the West Midlands, but we also work nationally and internationally. So we have that local, regional, national, international kind of focus to the work that we do. So I just want to say a little bit about that question that I posed has been kind of really central to what we do at the BLI. How do we get more of the leadership we need to tackle genuinely complex challenges? And I've used climate change here as an example, but there are plenty of others that we could explore as well. So it is still the case that the dominant, the kind of most common idea about what a leader is or what leadership is associated with that kind of rather sort of heroic model of leadership and the leader. We tend still to think of leadership as being contained within individuals. We tend to look up for leadership. We think that somehow leadership comes from people who are more senior or more important, or have a kind of high profile role. We tend therefore still that the stereotypes of leadership, and we know from everything we know about people's associations, if you give people the word leader and you ask them their associations, then it's still stereotypically associated with masculine traits. It still tends to be associated with racially oriented traits. Whiteness is still closely associated with leadership. So there are lots of reasons why we might think the model of the hero leadership, which is so pervasive, needs to be challenged, needs to be rethought, reimagined, precisely because of all the ways that it will tend to discriminate, oppress, and marginalize. And I would share all of those reservations with the notion of hero and heroic leadership. But there are other reasons as well to think that the hero model of leadership might not be what we need for many of the complex challenges that we're facing. So even if we weren't worried about all of the kind of ethical dimensions of the hero leader and the ways in which it gets associated with marginalization and potentially with oppression and other things, we should still be, we might ask ourselves, well, what might it be good for functionally? What could it help us achieve? So that sort of idea about leadership might be helpful if there's sort of really simple outcomes that we're aiming to achieve. If it were the case that we could get everybody to think that one thing is important and line them all up in a series of kind of, little switches that we could pull. And if we just pull the right number of switches and get people to do the right kinds of things in the right kinds of orders, we'd get the outcome that we want. It's a kind of idea which is really based in the sort of Industrial Revolution and the sort of factory model of production. And if the outcomes that we want are like that, then maybe that model of leadership is at least functional. It might at least get some of the outcomes that we want. The trouble is that most of the pressing contemporary challenges that we face aren't like that. So they're not like that target in the bottom of the slide. They're much more like that ambiguous and obscure picture at the top. If we're talking about things like how do we tackle and address climate change? How do we reduce inequalities of various kinds? How do we enable a city like Birmingham to thrive? How do we create cultures that are inclusive? These aren't simple questions. These are definitionally complex questions. They have multiple causes. They have multiple interacting factors which are going to impact on the outcomes. We will see disagreement both around the causes and around what we should do about them and about what the desirable outcomes are. So there's contestation at every level. These are definitionally complex. And if the challenges we're facing are like that, then maybe we need very different ideas about what leadership should be, and we need different sorts of ways of developing it. And that's really the focus of the work that we do at the BLI. So for example, my colleague, Dr. Rachel Lilly, has led some work looking at the ways that public servants in senior positions, actually in the government of Wales, what is it, how do they make sense of the challenges that they're facing? And one of the things that she discovered, and one of the areas that we pursue, is to begin to understand that the way that we perceive of a problem, the perception that we bring to it, the ideas that we preference and we say are important, those that we marginalize, the issues that we ignore, don't even see, the biases and assumptions that we bring into the act of leadership will shape our understanding both of the problem that we're trying to address and what is the right kind of leadership to bring to it. So actually, developing capacity amongst people trying to exercise leadership to get different kinds of perspective, that's what the skydiving image is hoping to represent, to see more, to see the things that we would otherwise miss, to notice and attend to those things that we marginalize and take less account of. All of those kinds of skills and capacities may be particularly important when what we're trying to do is make progress on complex challenges where there's a high degree of uncertainty and a high degree of ambiguity, where we need to think about multiple stakeholders, multiple perspectives, multiple different points of view, and we need to work with them all simultaneously. So that's just one example of how we understand that the perception that we bring to leadership shapes the kind of leadership that we bring and that we offer. And this is particularly important when we're trying to address these deeply complex challenges that are going to have huge impacts in the world. It's a bit like, it sometimes feels like we're trying to solve, contemporary, quantum physics with the tools of the Newtonian era. In the world of leadership, that's the scale of change that we may need. So that's what we're interested in at the Birmingham Leadership Institute. That's where our research goes. And then we take that research and we design it and develop it into leadership development programs, both through our masters and talk programs, but working with leaders at multiple levels, senior, junior, activists in communities, chief executives of organizations, to try and develop their capacity for this kind of leadership that embraces and works with complexity. So alongside that question about perspective taking, how do we increase our capacity to take multiple perspectives? Some of the other capacities that we're working on and helping leaders to develop are things like what we call self-relating. How do I get a sense of the way that my inner world and my inner sets of reactions and my inner responses are shaping my capacity to lead in the outer world? Can I develop that capacity to notice both what's going on inside and to understand how it's affecting what I do outside? We also work with what we call opposable thinking. Can we develop greater capacity to work with opposing ideas? And rather than seeing them as either ors or binaries, work with them as polarities, work with them as points on a spectrum so that we can hold multiple possibilities simultaneously. If we're working in complex problems, we don't know what the answers are. There's a high degree of uncertainty. And so moving into conclusion and holding answers too tightly too quickly is really problematic. But our capacity to do the opposite is quite underdeveloped. How do we develop more of that? And then finally, wrapping all of those together, what we call complexity handling. How do we handle the complexity of the world that we're engaged with? How do we handle the complexity of the problems, our own organizational life, our individual challenges, and manage that in the round so that the leadership that we bring has more chance of enabling more progress on some of these really pressing challenges. So that's what we're about. As I say, we are very oriented towards to practice, and so we're always keen to hear from people who are trying to exercise leadership in whatever space, in whatever domain. And if you're interested in the kind of work that we do please get in touch, because we would certainly love to engage with you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everybody, and thank you for the questions that have been flooding in during the talks, both from you in the room and hopefully people watching remotely. Some really interesting questions, and what I'd like you to do is take a moment to look at those questions and to like the ones that you think you would have asked if you hadn't been listening so intently, and also if there's anything missing there. While you're doing that, I think I'll just ask a general question, which is one of the ones that has come in, and ask each of the panelists to answer this question, because I think it's an interesting one, because we've been hearing about quite focused research, and to a greater or lesser degree, all of these focus into policy. So how and we'll just go down the line, but how does the research that you do actually focus on national or international policy and therefore have impact? And I think for each of you, the answer will be slightly different.
Yes, thank you. So the work that I do is, of course, largely theoretical. I'm not an expert in how to best bring things about. But there is definitely interest of policymakers in the research that I do. So if you look online, I've had a number of interviews with journalists. A couple of hundred global websites have reported on my arguments, and then it gets partly taken up by policymakers. So I've been invited by the COVID-19 committee of the House of Lords to contribute, for instance, in their inquiry on how digital access influences well-being in the UK. There was a draft law in Puerto Rico that used, for instance, one of my articles to argue that there should be a new law for all Puerto Ricans to actually have internet access. So the ways in which that happened are not always clear in how the interest is generated, but there's definitely interest on the part of politicians and of policymakers to learn more about what is actually important about internet access, and I hope I can help further there.
Thank you.
Oof. It's a tricky question, isn't it? I suppose one of the ways that we look at trying to change policy is the fact that actually the research we do uses lots of new techniques. It's we like to think it's cutting edge technologies, which means that the world of medicine is changing. We now 3D print things like bone grafts. You can now start getting cell therapies and things like this. And this is really pushing the regulations that are already out there in order to keep the patient safe. But I think what's coming around now is we need to create an environment where the patient is safe, but it also is flexible enough to allow these new technologies, which didn't sit in the old take it in a pill format, to allow them to actually come to the forefront. So I suppose the way that we're pushing policy and changing policy is the fact that actually we're trying to push the boundaries and come up with new technologies which expand the regulations.
Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, I'll split the answer into two areas again, in sort of the sport and the exercise, because it's probably quite different for each. But certainly in terms of sport, probably the main area of policy that you'd want to influence if you're trying to impact upon anti-doping education is through the policies and the guidance that's put out by the World Anti-Doping Agency. And we did some research a couple of years ago that developed a research agenda that was a 10-year, so from 2020 to 2030, like a research agenda for identifying the most important areas of research to be conducted in the area of doping. And the World Anti-Doping Agency used that to inform their social science strategy, and it's now influencing their funding decisions. in terms of the areas that they're identifying as being the most important areas and target areas for their funding stream. So that's one area that we've influenced so far. Some work that we're looking at doing at the moment, just applying for funding to do an evaluation of the international standard. So that's one of the policies, the International Standard for Education. It's one of the policies that the World Anti-Doping Agency utilised. It's just come into force in 2021, so we're hoping to do an evaluation of its first implementation last year and a global evaluation. And then hopefully that will then influence future iterations of the international standard as that develops and moves forward. In the exercise context, what we're hoping to do is influence policy through our work with the needle exchange clinics, identifying, if we can identify what best practice looks like, the potential influence that these harm reduction services are having, what we would hope is that that can then be informing guidelines and guidance that's put forward to clinics in terms of best practice, but also in terms of the funding. So there's not enough funding of these needle exchange clinics at the moment, so what we'd like to see is try to demonstrate the benefit that they're producing so that there can be more funding put towards them, and then they can do more of the work that they like to do.
I think in my case, the influence to policy is around drug development and safety, how safe a drug needs to be before it's approved to be used in patients. The drug that I showed in the slide, cisplatin, we use it. 50% of the chances is if you get cancer, you will have cisplatin. But I don't think that drug would be approved today just because our standards have changed so much in terms of safety. It's a drug that is very messy, it's very, the side effects are very heavy on the patient. And I think when you are in drug discovery, you do understand that there are different standards of what a side effect can be, but we really need to draw a line on being the patient first and having the patient safety at the beginning of everything that we do.
So the question was about policy, and I think for us it's actually more about what I would call practice. So I think we have a strong focus and impact on what I would call leadership practice. What is it that people actually do when they're seeking to lead? So the way that we do that is principally through the programs that we run of various kinds, and we're really lucky because we get to work with people who are, not in formal roles, people in activist positions, for example, or community-based leadership, or we work with people who are early in their careers, new graduates who are on development programs, right the way through to people who are in senior hierarchical positions within their organisation. We also get to work with organisations sort of in the round, so we're in an extended piece of work at the moment with Birmingham City Council, which is obviously right on our doorstep, around how they conceive and develop and enable their leadership for the city as a whole. So I think our main focus really is on how do we influence leadership practice, and that's a strong bit. But there is a policy dimension as well, because the way that different sectors nationally and internationally invest in and develop leadership varies hugely. And therefore, the ideas that people bring about what is it that, when we're investing in leadership development industry is maybe $5 billion globally. It's a lot of money. What is it that we think we're investing in? Well, that depends on what you think leadership is. So there is a sort of policy element to this, which is how do we influence the people who are spending the big bucks on leadership to spend it on the things that we think might actually make a difference? And there we do work with national and international partners to try and influence and shape that as well.
Thanks. So you can see the impact of that research is different across the board, but all that fundamental research has real value to society, and that, as I said at the beginning, is really what universities are for. Please keep the questions coming in and keep liking them, because it helps me triage them. There are almost 50 questions now, and if you add in the likes, that's a huge number of people wanting to know stuff, and we won't be able to cover it all in this session. We'll keep going until I get told we've finished. What we'll do at the end, all the panellists have agreed that they'll take the questions away and they'll get back and try and answer those questions offline on the Slido. So we hopefully get an answer to your question, even if we don't manage to cover it in the session. But as the discussion develops, please keep the likes and the extra questions coming. I'm trying to look at all the questions, but I'm looking obviously more at the ones that have been liked the most. I'll now go down the line and we'll ask the sort of top type of questions for each of the speakers. And so, Merton, something that's been asked in a number of different ways is about the funding of free internet and how will it be funded? But also other people are asking other questions about why should we fund the internet when some people haven't got enough food or housing?
Yes, thank you for that. So one thing that's important here is to be clear about the size of the challenge. The right that I'm advocating for is not a right that would guarantee glass fiber cable connections and the newest iPhone to people necessarily. That's not what we're aiming for. The reason why there should be a right is because we need adequate opportunities we need the internet for having adequate opportunities to realize our basic rights and also many of our human rights. So the question rather is how much internet does someone need to adequately realize the educational opportunities in society, to have adequate opportunities to exercise their rights to free speech, free assembly. And that challenge also financially will depend on how much internet access already exists in a country. So in developing societies, it seems that there are fewer people that don't have access to the internet. I think in the UK, the estimate is about 10% of households who have not a secure connection to the internet, which is quite a lot if you think about it. How do we close that? It could be publicly funded, yes. There were political parties, at least one in the last election, that promised free broadband for all British households till 2030. We might want to close this gap using public funds. In other countries, there have been other models, for instance, having those providers who make a lot of money providing this basic service pay into a fund that then helps pay for access for people that can't afford it. So there's various ways. It's not just a one-size-fits-all way of paying for this. It's not only a one-way street, though, because if you educate people better, if you allow people better to take part in the economy, you will get payback, you will get payoffs in that way. One more point about developing countries, the challenge there is obviously bigger because there are a lot more people that don't have internet access. One thing to note is the importance of calling this a human right is that those countries then would also have a claim to development aid that would help them develop something like a basic infrastructure. The UN Secretary General a couple of days ago outlined 5 major challenges that the world faces today. One of them was ensuring digital access for everyone. So it is being taken very, very seriously at the highest level. You can't eat internet access, but neither can you eat free speech. And it's not just that human rights are just about clothing, food, and that's it. Rather, if you have internet access, you might be able to participate better in the economy. That might allow you to earn money to buy food, for instance. There's lots of knock-on effects. And so, yeah, I think there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think there are various ways that we could go, and it's not unaffordable. The World Bank said that more people in the world have access to internet access already than have to clean water.
Challenging. Okay, so Richard, people are asking, and obviously there might be some pragmatism in this, does this method cause more pain than the normal method because it heals in a different way?
No, it's when you actually get the trauma, actually one of the biggest ways to get an ulcer on the eye, especially within the developed world, is through contact lens and actually bad use of contact lens where you can end up getting an infection, builds up underneath the lens, which effectively eats away at the tissue. If we leave that sort of grim thought behind, the pain happens at that point. You can then start treating this and you will end up getting better, basically. But the idea here is that you just put a drop on which doesn't either contribute to the pain or relieve it. It should just leave it in the state that it's in. Actually, I think a lot of the nerves are actually removed at this point, so you don't get as much pain anyway. And allow it to heal much better over time. So the healing process actually would take quite a long while. If you think about a cut on your skin, for instance, you don't have the pain all the way through the healing process. So this would be healing it out of that pain time frame, really. So Yes, so it's not really looking at the painful point, but hopefully the comfort of wearing the eye drop should be quite nice as well. Other ways of doing this at the moment would be putting contact lenses in. The contact lens creates a physical barrier, and you would have to change that contact lens every day in order to make sure you don't renew your ulcer. So actually you remove the pain that might be found by actually wearing a contact lens and taking it out and anything like that. So yeah, it should be less painful.
I've never had any luck with contact lenses and they sound just as painful anyway. So. Okay, thank you. So Ian, a question for you which is trending, which is I think getting to the ethics of some of this, which is should we do more work on steroids to make those steroids safer so that you reduce the side effects of them being presumably then used in doping, which seems to be a quite complex question.
Yeah, well, there's probably two sides to that. I guess there's the side on the work that's needed to actually develop drugs that could do that, and but also there's what would we do ethically, I guess, if they were available. Just on the first part of that, so there have been attempts to do that. There's a class of drugs called SARMs, so selective androgen receptor modulators, which aim to have the same effects of anabolic steroids, but without the downside. So anabolic androgenic steroids have two key aspects to them. So there's the androgenizing aspect, which is about building of muscle tissue, which is the bit that people primarily want from the substance. But then they have the androgenic effects, which is the masculinizing effects, and that's part of the reason why you see much more use in males than in females, because obviously they're much more damaging and more harmful, those effects for the females. So the idea of developing SARMs was to try and get the benefits, but without the sort of harmful androgenizing effects. But in clinical trials, SARMs have been shown they've not got very far through clinical trials. Often in the early stages, they've been linked with tumour growth, and often the clinical trials in animal studies, and they've never progressed too far. I think they got to sort of phase 2 for one or two of them, but that's not to say that we don't see them, and they are banned substances, and you still see examples of athletes using them. And there's a couple of famous, quite well publicised cases last year of athletes testing positive for SARM. So athletes are still trying to use them, but they've not really been successful in developing those. I guess in terms of if they were available and what would be the ethics of use, that would sort of change the dynamic, I think, in terms of in sport. Because personally, I think at the moment, sort of the prohibition stance is the correct one in sport, because because we don't want a situation where people feel as though they should be compelled and forced to use substances that might be harmful to them just so that they can compete on a level playing field with someone else. If you can, so in terms of the reasons why substances are placed on the prohibited list, they have to meet 2 of 3 criteria. So one is that they're against the spirit of sport, another is that they're performance enhancing, and another is that they're harmful to health. So if you remove that sort of harmful to health, you've only really got the performance enhancing. Obviously, if people are going to use them, you assume there's a performance enhancing effect. But then the spirit of sport one is the one that is a little bit unclear. So that would be where the real question would be, is whether this would be ethically correct. And I think in terms of my personal view is, if they're not harmful to for use, it would make it a much stronger argument for considering use within sport. And there are examples of drugs that are not on the banned list at the moment. So caffeine, as many people will probably be consuming in different ways today, is performance enhancing, and it has previously been on the banned list, but it's not now. It's viewed as being performance enhancing, but there's not strong evidence for harm to health as long as it's not used in extreme doses. And it's not seen to be against the spirit of sport. So I guess if something could be developed that was performance enhancing, you'd get more into the territory of what we're seeing with sort of the performance enhancing trainers that we've seen in that debate in the last 2 or 3 years, where there might have to be limits placed on use. The problem becomes you can no longer compare performances with past performances, which in a lot of sports people like to do. So I think it would be question for potentially individual sports and how they wanted to regulate particular substances and what the impact on records in that sport might be. But yeah, I think the first thing is that we have to develop such substances yet, and I don't think we're close to that at the moment.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question. As somebody who's an asthmatic who used to take Ventolin before football, I used to worry that I was cheating.
Yeah, there's certainly quite a lot of asthma medications used more in athletic performance than in non-athletic performance.
It never did any good for me.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. Keep these coming in. So, Isolde, there's lots of questions about the mitochondria and the way that the metals target the mitochondria, and if you've had any success there and why the mitochondria are so important.
Let's start by defining mitochondria. Why are they important in cells? Mitochondria are the little machinery that gives energy to cells. Yes? And if we compare a normal cell versus a cancer cell, a normal cell is much more relaxed. It's alive, it's keeping there, but it's not in a hurry. If you think about a cancer cell, they need to keep up with proliferation. They need to keep up with tumor growth. And this means that they have much, much higher requirements for energy. Okay? So the mitochondria, as the machinery that produces the energy, are working basically over time to keep up with those energy requirements. So at that point, you have a machinery that is very different functioning between a normal and a cancer cell. And when you have a machinery that is to the top of its capacity, if you just give them a little bit of a push, it just breaks down. You can imagine Commonwealth 2022, a sprinter, yes? And if they are running at the top of the speed and you push them a little bit through the pack, they are going to go face first on the floor, yes? Because at the top of the speed in which they are, they probably cannot handle change very easily. Now, if you take me jogging, that I'm very, very, very bad, and you push me at the back, I may stumble a little bit, I may not like it, but I'm not going to fall. And after a couple of stumbling steps, I will keep running. And that is exactly what the drugs I developed try to do with mitochondria. So we generate a little bit of stress, and in a machinery that is working to the maximum of its capacity, it just breaks it down, and the cell says, I cannot deal with this anymore, and proceeds to die. While we generate the same stress on normal cells, and yes, they don't like it for the first 24 hours, but they survive. So that gives us a little bit of an edge, a little bit of a difference. And the hope is that in the long term, this little bit of a difference can cause big differences in side effects that the patient may suffer when they are in these drugs. So this is why we choose mitochondria. This is why we decide to target them. And because most of the stress that we generate in cells is about throwing electrons around and moving electrons from one place to another, metals are fantastic to do that. And that is why we use them. There are more bonds involved, more electrons involved, and they are more capable of existing at different numbers of electrons. So this is why we combine the two to fight cancer.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you always think of metals as passive and just sitting there. But of course,
yes,
they are, as you said, highly reactive, and that's why we have them in green plants and red blood.
Yes.
Yeah, really interesting. I've got a bit of plant biology in there. Apologies for that. Going to Christopher. I mean, there's lots for everybody, but and there's some close calls. But Christopher, so a question here that's getting a lot of likes is what strategies are there to address people's sexist bias in their perception of leadership? I mean, presumably that's a historical thing that you're trying to address.
Yeah, it's a great question, and of course, there's sexist bias, there's racist bias, all sorts of other biases as well. There's bias about age. What do we think? Do we associate leadership with certain people of certain ages? Let alone, issues around homophobia, disableism, and so on. So bias, the question about bias and how it constructs leadership is really important. The place that I would start around this question is to say the first thing that I think is important is that we take the notion of bias sort of out of the culture wars. One of the things that's become really problematic when we're dealing with these questions of bias is that they've become highly politicized. I'm not a social psychologist, but in the world of social psychology, it is not even remotely contentious to suggest that the human brain, we are wired for bias. We have developed all sorts of mental shortcuts to enable us to navigate overwhelming amounts of information that we have to process as we navigate through the world. And you can see there'd be all sorts of evolutionary advantages to be able to doing that. And those mental shortcuts, many of them, sit underneath all sorts of biases that we make. There's a wealth of evidence which underpins the lived experience that whilst we're not, as it were, wired for racism, we are wired for tribalism. This is in a phrase used by my colleague at Harvard, Robert Livingston, by which he means that we are wired to look for those people whom we, as it were, associate with as being part of our group and those who we associate as being part of an outgroup. We have known for decades that it takes almost no prompt to get people to form into in-groups and out-groups under experimental conditions. One of my favorites is an experiment which assigned randomly groups of people to being either, they were told they were either a Kandinsky person or a Klee person, these two artists. They were completely random associations, and you put them into their Kandinsky group and their Klee group, and on the basis of absolutely no other evidence at all, they start making all sorts of assumptions about their groupness as opposed to the other groupness and vice versa. So we've known this for a very, very long time. And in recent times, those sorts of, to my way of thinking, uncontentious insights, which we really need to draw on and use and apply, have become highly politicized. So that would be my starting point, to sensitize us all to the notion that bias is normal, and therefore not to act in the knowledge that we will be biased in all sorts of ways, is to allow the consequences of that bias to affect the way that we are, the way that we offer our leadership, the way that we structure our organizations. So there's an awful lot we could say about how do we deal with with bias. But for me, the starting point is to acknowledge and accept that it is an inherent part of how we operate in the world. We don't get a choice as to whether we're going to be biased. The only choice we get is whether we engage with that, work with that, and take the various steps that then need to be taken to accommodate that. And just very briefly, so what do we do? Well, we need everything. We need legislation, we need policy, we need regulation, we need all of that range of activities which will tend to act in other directions. But we also need to develop the personal awareness and capacity and ability to put bias above the line in our conversations and our decision-making processes so that we're more able to work with it. That's a very partial answer to a very big question, but I hope it gives you a sense.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yes, a really good question. And obviously, there's loads underneath that we all need to take on board. Right, we've got just over 5 minutes left, which if we're good, we can get through one more question each. Is that okay? Is that right? Okay. So, Merton, one of the questions that started trending very early on was a question about censorship and the internet. So, misinformation and dangerous content. So if everybody's got it, are we then in a problem that everybody's subject to this negative side of it?
Right. So how do we determine what should be removed and who removes this sort of stuff that's dangerous? How do we determine that online? I think there are big questions behind it, of course. There's the question of free speech and limits to free speech. There's the question of how the internet has changed our information environment. And we are only beginning to understand in many ways how that has changed. So let me give a short answer here to save time, or at least to not go over time. One really important standard is that we should respect existing offline rights online. And we're not doing that very well right now. There are examples of, for instance, countries starting to have special district attorneys that just prosecute hate crime online, where journalists can just forward emails where they've been threatened, for instance, and that will get taken up then, just as one example. So there are lots of ways that we need to try to make the internet a safer way for all of us. One standard really that we should follow there is that people are not attacked online arbitrarily or in general, that our rights that we have in society offline are also respected online. That'll take a lot of regulation of private businesses and companies that are not adhering to those standards. That will take basically digital skills training and training people to be online users that are respectful in a certain way to others. And that will take public authorities actually making sure that our rights are respected online.
Big question, but as we say, we're getting a bit time limited now. But again, we can send the questions on to the speakers, and maybe there'll be some further feedback or references that people can follow up from, if that's appropriate. Okay, so Richard, your currently top trending question is about side effects. I mean, it sounds great now, but what about the tissue formation in future years? Is there going to be some problem going forward?
Yeah, I mean, with any clinical trial, any new drug, any new medical device, there is a certain amount of testing you can do beforehand, and then you need to then take that testing and show that it works and there shouldn't be any side effects, hopefully, and then you start your next stages of testing. So that will, the pre stuff is preclinical. You then go through clinical trials. Clinical trials are not short. Clinical trials go multiple stages, increasing from just small safety data up to looking at the effects, dose escalation, and looking at a much larger population. And then actually, once you go through those, you don't stop, you continue monitoring, and you look at what's happening over many years to come. So as much as we believe now, there should not be these long-term side effects. We would continue to monitor going forward with anything that we do to make sure that they don't pop up many years later. And if they did, you then go through a recall, you stop people using it, you try and understand what's happening, and you either try and rectify it to help those that have undergone that, or you try and rectify it to stop it happening in the future.
Okay, thank you. Ian, let me find the top question for you. So this is what would sport look like if there was no doping regulation?
In 1 minute. I think it would look very different in terms of the performance levels. Obviously, I mean, to some degree, I think you can look at exercise as a case to give you some examples. So I think you would see much higher levels of performance, but you'd also see quite different people potentially getting involved in sport. You would see differences in terms of parents, in terms of their encouragement of their children getting into sport. I think. I mean, if you put yourself in the place of a parent and you're advising your child to try to get to elite levels of sport, knowing that they're going to need to take drugs to perform at that level, that changes that decision-making process. So, yeah, I think we'd obviously see much higher levels of performance, but we'd see quite different people who are more prepared to take risks would gravitate towards it. And we might see fewer people wanting to take part in elite sport, but those that do would probably, on the whole, perform better. But yeah, obviously it's a theoretical question, and it would really depend on which drugs are allowed and the amounts that they're allowed in. There have been some suggestions of adopting a harm reduction model where you would actually monitor and allow certain levels of substances to be used. The problem with that is that the harmful effects are quite idiosyncratic, so you see quite a lot marked differences. Some people can use quite high levels of a drug and not suffer any consequences. Someone else uses very low levels and suffers quite harmful side effects. So where do you put that level on safe use? So you really need some drugs with good evidence that they could be used safely before starting that conversation seriously, I think.
Okay, thanks, Ian. That's a really complex question, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isolde, then, hopefully this is a simple question to answer.
Okay.
Do your metal treatments stop the cancer cells developing, or do they kill them stone dead?
We try to kill them. That is the intention, and the intention is to do many things at the same time inside the cell, and that means that our drugs are what we would call multi-targeted, and the reason is that that also helps the resistance to build up. If I try to hit somebody and I always hit them in the head, the person is also going to very, very quickly develop this, yes? And they will block my attack. If I try to hit the person, I hit them in the head and then on the side and maybe then in the back, I always would catch them unaware, and that is how resistance is more difficult to develop. So that is also the key of using metals, that they have the ability of allowing us to do multi-targeting.
Thank you.
Activity.
Very precise and concise. So, Christopher, last one for you, and there's some really complicated questions here, but hopefully this is a straightforward one. Historically, have there been previous examples of what you would consider to be good leadership, or are we in a new era?
So, so the normal way of answering this question would be to give you some of my personal heroes and heroines, which I think would be the wrong thing to do. So I think leadership is a practice, not a position. I think it's a choice that some of us make some of the time. So it's about what anybody is doing in the moment, not what they are or the role that they have. So because of my work, I have the great privilege of seeing really amazing leadership all the time, by which I mean leadership as something which is people taking responsibility, making the choice for enabling others to achieve some sort of shared purpose in conditions of uncertainty, which is intended to have positive outcomes on people, places, and planet. That's sort of my version of how I understand leadership. And if we understand leadership like that, then I think we see it in our families, I think we see it amongst our friends, I think we see it in organisations all the time. I would also say that given we are in the UK, and today is a particularly interesting day to be talking about leadership, we also see the very opposite of that quite a lot too.
A very topical way on which to end. Thank you for that, Christopher. So I think we've come to the end of time now. Not time completely, just the time of this event. And thank you all for taking part. Thank you for the absolutely fantastic questions from both the people in the room and the people watching online. You'll be able to follow this after online, obviously. I really like these events because I always feel humbled and I always learn loads of stuff that I didn't know. And I also feel very proud to be part of a university which, as I said right at the beginning, finds things out and in the expert way that our panel have done, tells people about them. So I'd like you all to give them all a nice round of applause, and the people at home can do it as well. And I think that's the end of the session.